My name is Caroline Marsh, and I want to tell you something before I tell you everything else. I want you to know that the hardest part of this story is not the fraud. It is not the forged documents, not the court dates, not the months of forensic accounting, not even the moment I stood in a post office parking lot in November, holding a manila envelope stuffed with 3 years of mail addressed to me that I had never seen. The hardest part is that the man who did this to me was my father. And for the first 41 years of my life, I loved him without reservation. Before I take you back to the beginning, I want to ask you to take a moment and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Drop your location in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And tell me where you're listening from. This story is going to take a while to tell. And I want to tell all of it, because the parts that feel slow and procedural are the parts that actually matter. The slow parts are where the truth lives. Let me take you back to October. My father, Gerald Marsh, died on a Tuesday. He had been sick for 14 months. Congestive heart failure, the kind that arrives quietly and then accelerates in a way that makes you feel like you were never really prepared, even though you had over a year to get there. He was 67 years old. He died in the house he shared with his second wife, Pamela, in Scottsdale, Arizona, in a hospital bed that had been set up in the sunroom because he'd refused to go back to the hospital, and Pamela had agreed to hospice care at home. I flew out from Philadelphia 3 days before he passed. I held his hand. I told him I loved him. He said my name once, very clearly, in a way that sounded like he was confirming something. Then he went to sleep and didn't wake up. I am a certified public accountant. I have been one for 16 years. I work for a mid-sized regional firm in Philadelphia, and my specialty is forensic accounting, which means I spend my professional life finding the places where numbers don't add up, where money went somewhere it wasn't supposed to go, where documents have been altered or fabricated or selectively omitted. I am good at my job. I have testified in 3 federal proceedings. I have been called by a judge in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, a witness of exceptional precision. I tell you this not to impress you, but because it matters to the story. It matters that I do this professionally. It matters that I still missed it for 3 years. That is the part I have had to sit with. That is the part that keeps me up some nights. Not what they did, but how long they did it before I found out. The key was in a coffee mug. Pamela had called me 2 weeks after the funeral to say she was going through Gerald's study and had found some personal items that belonged to me. A few photographs, a watch that had been my grandfather's, some papers. She said it in a voice that was carefully modulated, the way she always spoke to me, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed until it sounded natural. I drove out to Scottsdale the following weekend. I want to be clear that I did not go there looking for anything. I went to collect the photographs and the watch. I went because my father was dead, and I wanted the things that had been his. The study was exactly as I remembered it. Dark wood paneling, a leather desk chair that had been reupholstered twice in my lifetime, bookshelves that held more golf trophies than books. Gerald Marsh had been a civil engineer for 30 years before he retired, and the only evidence of that in the study was a framed blueprint of a bridge he'd worked on in 1989, mounted behind the desk in a way that always felt like he was trying to remind himself of a version of himself he'd been proud of. Pamela had laid out my items in a neat row on the desk blotter: the photographs, the watch in a small velvet box, a manila folder with some old tax returns that had my name on them from a joint account my father and I had shared briefly in the early 2000s when I was in graduate school, and he'd helped me with tuition. I thanked her. I picked everything up. I was almost to the door when I noticed the mug. It was a ceramic mug on the corner of the desk, the kind you get at a hardware store. Plain blue, no logo. It was holding pens and a pair of reading glasses, and a small brass key on a ring with a green plastic tag. I don't know why I stopped. I don't know why I picked it up. I think it was the tag. The tag had a number on it written in my father's handwriting, and the number was familiar in a way I couldn't immediately place. I stood there for 4 seconds. I counted them later, reconstructing the moment the way I reconstruct financial timelines. And then I recognized it. The number was my childhood zip code. Not the zip code of the house we'd grown up in, the zip code of the town. Chandler, Arizona, 85224. The town where my mother had raised me after the divorce, where I'd gone to school, where I'd had my first job at a sandwich shop on Alma School Road. That zip code, in my father's handwriting, on a key I had never seen. I set the photographs and the watch back down on the desk. "What's this?" I asked Pamela. She turned from the bookshelf where she'd been straightening something. She looked at the key. Something moved across her face. Not quite fear, but a cousin of it. A recalculation. "Oh," she said, "that's probably just a storage key. Gerald had a storage unit for a while. Old golf clubs, I think." I looked at the key. I looked at her. "The tag has my old zip code on it," I said. "Does it?" She came closer, tilting her head as though she were seeing it for the first time. "I really couldn't say. You're welcome to take it if you think it's yours." She said it so smoothly that I almost believed her. That's the thing about Pamela. She had a surface that was very difficult to disturb. She had been my stepmother for 19 years. And in 19 years I had never once caught her in a visible lie. Not because she didn't lie, as I would eventually understand, but because she was exceptionally good at it. I took the key. I put it in my coat pocket. I picked up my photographs and my grandfather's watch, and I drove to my hotel. I sat on the edge of the bed and turned the key over in my hands. And I thought about that zip code. I thought about why my father would have a key tagged with my childhood zip code in a mug on his desk in Scottsdale, Arizona. I thought about it for a long time. Then I called the post office in Chandler. I want to pause here for a moment because I know some of you are already ahead of me. Some of you have already guessed what that key opened. But I want you to understand what it felt like to not know yet. To sit in a hotel room in Scottsdale, 2 weeks after burying your father, holding a key and having only a feeling. Not a fact. Not a document. Just a feeling that something was wrong. The way you feel when a column of numbers looks right at a glance, but something in your peripheral vision keeps pulling you back to the page. That feeling is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is almost polite. It sits beside you and waits. The Chandler post office confirmed that the key corresponded to a P.O. box registered to Gerald Marsh at their location on Alma School Road. The box had been opened 7 years ago. The annual fee was paid automatically from a checking account. The postal worker I spoke with was helpful, but matter of fact. She told me the box was still active, still receiving mail, and that, as next of kin with a copy of the death certificate, I could submit a request to access it or close it. I told her I would come in person. I drove to Chandler the next morning. It was a 40-minute drive from Scottsdale, and I made it in 34 minutes because I got on the freeway before rush hour and because I was not entirely paying attention to the speed limit. I had the death certificate in my bag. I had my ID. I had the key. I told myself I was simply being thorough. I told myself this was probably nothing. Old statements, some professional correspondence, maybe something related to property in Chandler that Gerald had owned decades ago and never fully resolved. I told myself this in a very deliberate, methodical way that I now recognize as the way I talk myself through things when I already know they are not nothing. The box was in the second row from the bottom, near the left wall of the lobby. I crouched down and put the key in the lock. My knees were on the linoleum floor of the Chandler post office. I turned the key. The door swung open. It was packed. Not overflowing. Someone had been emptying it regularly, because the mail inside was recent. The top envelopes dated within the last 3 months. But the box was full in the way a box gets when you haven't emptied it in 3 or 4 weeks. There were at least 40 envelopes. Maybe more. I reached in and pulled out the first handful and stood up and looked at the return addresses. First National Community Bank, Fidelity Trust and Savings, First National Community Bank again, Fidelity Trust and Savings again. A quarterly statement from First National Community Bank. A notice from Fidelity Trust and Savings regarding account activity. A letter from First National Community Bank regarding a beneficiary designation update. Every envelope was addressed to Caroline Marsh. Every single one. I stood in the lobby of the Chandler post office with a stack of mail addressed to me. Mail I had never received. Mail that had been coming to a P.O. box I did not know existed. And I felt the room get very still. Not silent. There was a woman behind me, waiting to use the self-service kiosk, and the postal worker at the counter was processing a package. But still in the way that rooms get still when your body understands something before your mind has finished forming the sentence. I took everything out of the box. I put it all in my bag. I drove to a Panera Bread 2 blocks away, and I sat in a corner booth and I opened every envelope. 3 years of statements. 2 accounts I had never opened, never authorized, never heard of. A checking account at First National Community Bank in Chandler, Arizona, with my name and social security number. A trust account at Fidelity Trust and Savings, also in my name, also with my social security number, titled the Caroline E. Marsh Revocable Living Trust. The trust had been established 4 years ago. The initial funding was $340,000. The current balance, as of the most recent statement, was $18,400. That signature was mine. Except I had never signed it. I sat in that Panera Bread for 1 hour and 47 minutes. I ordered a coffee I didn't drink. I read every document 3 times. I photographed every page with my phone. I did not call anyone. I did not cry. I sat very still, and I let the numbers arrange themselves in my mind, the way numbers always do when I give them enough space. Into patterns, into sequences, into a story. $340,000. Established 4 years ago. Current balance, $18,400. That meant $321,600 had moved somewhere in 4 years. The statements showed regular withdrawals, some small, some large, none of them random. The largest single withdrawal was $87,000, dated 14 months ago, which was almost exactly when my father had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure, and his medical bills had begun to accumulate. The second largest was $62,000, dated 2.5 years ago. I did not yet know where those funds had gone, but I knew one thing with complete certainty. I had not authorized any of it. I called my lawyer from the Panera parking lot. His name is David Okafor, and he is a civil litigation attorney in Philadelphia who specializes in estate and trust disputes. I had referred clients to him twice over the years and had met him at a professional conference. He picked up on the second ring. I told him I needed to meet with him as soon as possible, that I had documents he needed to see, and that I believed I was the victim of trust fraud. He asked me to come to his office Monday morning. It was Saturday. I said I would be there. I drove back to Scottsdale. I did not stop at Pamela's house. I went to my hotel, ordered room service I didn't eat, and spent the rest of the afternoon reading the documents again. By 9 o'clock that evening, I had constructed a preliminary timeline on the hotel notepad. 4 pages of tight, precise notes organized by date, amount, and account. I had identified 7 distinct withdrawal patterns. I had noted 3 instances where the withdrawal amount corresponded, within a few days, to a known expense in my father's life: his golf club membership renewal, the down payment on the new truck he'd bought 2 years ago, and a trip he and Pamela had taken to Costa Rica that she had posted extensively on Facebook. I had not yet connected every dollar to a specific expenditure, but I had connected enough to understand what I was looking at. I want to tell you about the family before I go any further, because you need to understand the context. You need to understand who these people were to me. Not who they turned out to be, but who I believed them to be for the better part of my life. Because that is where the real damage lives. Not in the financial loss, in the revision. My parents divorced when I was 9. My mother, Lorraine Marsh, kept me and my younger brother Dennis in Chandler. My father moved to Scottsdale, which was close enough geographically that he remained present in a physical sense. Weekend visits, school events, the occasional holiday, but distant in the way that men of his generation often were when they decided they wanted a different life. He married Pamela 3 years after the divorce. I was 12. Pamela had no children of her own, and she seemed at first to make a genuine effort with Dennis and me. She came to my 8th grade graduation. She sent me a birthday card every year with a $20 bill inside until I was in my mid-20s, at which point she switched to Amazon gift cards. These are small things, I know. But small things are how you build a picture of someone. My father's relationship with me was complicated in the way that relationships between daughters and their fathers often are when the father has left the family home and is trying to manage his guilt and his pride simultaneously. Gerald Marsh was not a cruel man in any obvious sense. He was proud, sometimes dismissive, occasionally generous, and deeply invested in the idea of himself as a good father, even when his actions didn't support that idea. He paid child support reliably, which he mentioned approximately once a year until I was 40. He attended my college graduation. He called on my birthday without fail, always in the morning, always for exactly 12 minutes. I noticed the pattern when I was in my 30s, and it became a kind of grim joke I kept to myself. He told me he was proud of me when I passed my CPA exam, and I believe he meant it. I also believe he found my professional competence mildly threatening in a way he would never have articulated and possibly never consciously recognized. He was not a wealthy man, but he was comfortable. He had a pension from his engineering firm, Social Security, and a modest investment portfolio that he managed conservatively. He had owned the Scottsdale house outright since 2009, when he'd paid off the mortgage. He and Pamela lived simply. The Costa Rica trip was an exception, not the rule. And I had always assumed, without examining it carefully, that their finances were stable and self-sufficient. I had never given them money. I had never been asked for money, not directly, not in a way I recognized. That is the part that took me the longest to process. They didn't ask me. They took. Dennis is 3 years younger than me. He lives in Austin, Texas, works in IT, and has a wife named Kendra, and 2 kids under 6. Dennis and my father had a warmer relationship than I did, or at least a simpler one. They talked sports. They fished together twice a year. They had the easy shorthand of men who don't examine things too closely. Dennis had no idea what was happening. I am certain of that. Dennis was not part of what they built. I don't know whether that makes it better or worse. Sometimes I think it's worse, because it means they chose me specifically. I was the one with the income. I was the one with the professional reputation and the social security number that would look credible on a trust document. I was the one who had always handled the family's complicated things without complaint. When my mother needed her estate documents updated, I helped her find an attorney. When Dennis had a tax problem in 2017, I walked him through it. When my father had a dispute with a contractor in 2019, he called me first, even though I'm not a lawyer, because I was the one in the family who knew how to read a contract. That's who I was to them, the competent one, the one who handles things, the one who, it turned out, could be counted on to not look too closely at what was being done in her name. David Okafor's office is on the 14th floor of a building on Market Street in Philadelphia. He is a tall man in his mid-50s who wears very good suits and speaks in the precise, unhurried cadence of someone who has learned that rushing never helps anyone understand anything faster. I laid the documents on his conference table in chronological order, the way I would lay out an audit work paper, and I walked him through what I had found. He did not interrupt me. He took notes. He asked 4 questions, all of them specific. Had I ever resided in Arizona in the past 4 years? Had I ever been approached by anyone about establishing a revocable trust? Had I ever given anyone access to my Social Security number for any purpose in the past 5 years? And did I have any knowledge of the Fidelity Trust and Savings Branch in Chandler, Arizona? The answer to all 4 questions was no. He sat back and looked at the documents for a moment. Then he said, "Caroline, what you're describing, if the documents support it, is elder financial abuse in reverse. You're not the elder. You're the funding source. Someone established a trust in your name, funded it with what appears to be your assets, or assets obtained in your name, and has been withdrawing from it for 4 years. That's trust fraud. Depending on how the trust was established, specifically how your signature was obtained, it may also be forgery and identity theft." "My father died 2 weeks ago," I said. He looked up from the documents. "I know, I'm sorry." He paused. "That complicates the criminal component significantly, but it doesn't eliminate the civil remedies." "What about Pamela?" I asked. He picked up the trust document and looked at the signature page. "Is this her signature as trustee?" "Yes." "Then she's not complicated at all," he said. "She's a named party." "Before I go any further, I want to ask you something real. If you discovered that someone had been siphoning money from a trust established in your name without your knowledge for 3 years, how long would you wait before filing? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely asking, because I waited 2 weeks from the moment I opened that P.O. box to the moment I authorized David to begin the legal process. And some days, I think that was 2 weeks too long. And other days, I think it was exactly right. I needed those 2 weeks to be sure. To be absolutely, documentably, forensically sure. Because once you begin this process, there is no version of it that ends with your family intact. David's first action was to retain a forensic document examiner, a woman named Patricia Ewan, who works out of Phoenix and has been qualifying as an expert witness in Arizona courts for 22 years. I overnighted her copies of the trust document, the account opening documents for both bank accounts, and 3 signature samples of my actual handwriting, my tax returns, my professional license renewal, and a notarized statement I had filed in connection with a client matter 2 years earlier. Patricia examined the documents and produced a written report within 10 days. Her findings were specific and detailed in the way that expert findings always are, and I want to share them with you because they matter. The signature on the trust establishment document had several characteristics inconsistent with my genuine signature. The capital C in Caroline showed a clockwise loop that my authentic signature does not produce. My capital C opens to the right and closes with a slightly counterclockwise return, a habit I developed in college that has been consistent across 20 years of documents. The pressure distribution across the signature was heavier on the downstroke than my genuine signatures, which are relatively uniform in pressure. The letter spacing between Caroline and Marsh was wider than in any of my authenticated samples, and the signature on the bank account opening document, while slightly different from the trust document signature, showed the same clockwise loop on the capital C and the same heavy downstroke. In Patricia's professional opinion, both signatures were produced by the same person, and that person was not me. Patricia also examined the notarization on the trust document. The notary seal belonged to a woman named Rhonda Garrett, a licensed notary in Maricopa County, Arizona. Patricia noted that the ink impression of the seal was slightly off-center, in a way consistent with a portable stamp being used on an uneven surface, rather than the table-mounted embossers typically used by bank or title company notaries. She flagged this as worth investigating. David flagged Rhonda Garrett as a person of interest. It took David's investigator 4 days to find Rhonda Garrett. She was not difficult to find. She was listed in the Arizona Notary Public Database. She had a LinkedIn profile, and she had, until 6 months earlier, worked as a bookkeeper for a small property management company in Tempe. She had also, according to her Facebook page, attended the same church as Pamela for 11 years. They appeared, based on tagged photographs, to have been in the same women's Bible study group. There were photographs of them at church picnics, at a fundraiser for a local food bank, at what appeared to be a birthday party for someone named Gladys, who had turned 75. Rhonda Garrett had notarized a document with my forged signature on it. She had either been deceived, told that the person signing was me, perhaps shown a fake ID, or she had participated knowingly. Given her relationship with Pamela, David's opinion was that the latter was more likely. Given the portable stamp and the off-center impression, he thought the notarization had not taken place in any official setting. He thought it had taken place in someone's living room. I sat with that image for a long time. My signature forged on a document. A woman from Pamela's Bible study pressing a notary stamp onto the paper in what I imagined as a sunlit living room in Scottsdale or Tempe. Maybe with coffee on the table. Maybe with a candle burning. The ordinary domesticity of it. The way fraud can look exactly like an afternoon. Now I need to tell you about the money, because the money is where the story becomes something other than a family drama and becomes a forensic document. And the forensic document is important. David engaged a CPA colleague of mine named Stephen Holt, someone I trusted but who had no prior relationship with my family, to trace the fund flows from both accounts. Stephen spent 3 weeks on it. His report was 41 pages long. I read it twice. I am going to give you the version that matters. The trust at Fidelity Trust and Savings had been funded with $340,000. The source of that funding was a home equity line of credit, a HELOC, taken against a property in Chandler, Arizona, that I had inherited from my maternal grandmother in 2014. My grandmother, Edna Calloway, died in the spring of that year and left me her house on West Pecos Road in Chandler, a modest 3-bedroom ranch house that I had rented out since then, managed by a property management company, and which had appreciated significantly in the years since I acquired it. I had never taken any equity out of that property. I had never applied for a HELOC. I had never signed any loan documents related to that property in the 4 years since my grandmother's death. Someone else had. The HELOC had been approved by a mortgage lender in Phoenix, 18 months after I inherited the property. The application had been submitted with my name, my social security number, my income, my actual income, which would have been verifiable through tax records, and my signature. The property had appraised at $520,000 at the time of the application, which gave the lender sufficient equity to approve a $340,000 line of credit. The funds had been drawn in a single lump sum and deposited into the Fidelity Trust and Savings Trust account within 48 hours. So the sequence was this. They had identified my grandmother's property as an asset in my name. They had applied for a HELOC against it using my identity. They had used the proceeds to fund a trust also in my name. And then they had spent the trust funds over 4 years, while the HELOC accrued interest against the property I had inherited, and had always planned to eventually sell or continue renting. The HELOC was still active. It was now at its full draw, $340,000, plus 4 years of interest at a variable rate that had increased twice in that period. The total obligation against my grandmother's house was approximately $378,000. The house was worth, at current market, approximately $545,000. So the equity had not been entirely consumed. But the debt was real, and it was in my name, and I had not known it existed. $340,000, drawn over 4 years. Spent as follows, according to Stephen's trace. $87,000 used to pay medical bills and related expenses during my father's illness. This was the largest single withdrawal, and the one that required the least moral imagination to understand, even if it did not make it legal. $62,000 withdrawn in a lump sum 2.5 years ago, and traced, through a series of transfers, to a down payment on a vacation property in Sedona, Arizona, that was titled in Pamela's name alone. $44,000 in smaller withdrawals over 18 months. That corresponded to credit card payments on an account in Pamela's name. $38,000 to a contractor in Scottsdale who had renovated the kitchen and master bath of the Scottsdale house. $31,000 in what appeared to be cash withdrawals at ATMs in the Phoenix metro area over a 3-year period. The remaining $58,600, plus the $18,400 still in the account, represented smaller transactions, groceries, utilities, what looked like routine household expenses, that had been run through the trust account as though it were a personal checking account. Every line in Stephen's report was a decision someone had made. Every withdrawal was a moment when my father or Pamela, or both of them, had looked at the balance, decided what they needed, and taken it. I tried to think about what those moments had looked like, whether they had discussed it, whether there had been any hesitation, whether my father had ever, in those 4 years, in those 14 months of illness when the medical bills were coming in and the money was there and available, whether he had ever thought about calling me and telling me the truth, whether he had ever come close. I don't know the answer to that. I will never know the answer to that. That is one of the things I have had to accept. David sent a demand letter to Pamela on a Tuesday afternoon in December, 6 weeks after I had first opened the P.O. box. The letter was sent certified mail to her Scottsdale address, and by email to the address we had on file for her from my father's estate proceedings. It was 4 pages long, single-spaced, on his firm's letterhead. It laid out the facts as we had established them. The trust established without my knowledge or consent. The HELOC taken against my property without my knowledge or consent. The forgery of my signature on multiple documents. The notarization of those forged documents. And the withdrawal of $321,600 from the trust over a 4-year period. It identified the total amount of damages sought, including the principal of the HELOC, the accrued interest, and legal fees, as $412,000. It gave Pamela 30 days to respond through counsel. It also stated that if she did not respond within 30 days, or if her response was deemed inadequate, David would be filing a civil complaint in Maricopa County Superior Court, and simultaneously referring the matter to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. He sent it on a Tuesday. I know because I was in my office in Philadelphia when he called to confirm it had gone out, and I was in the middle of reviewing a client's financial statements, and I set the statements down on my desk and looked out the window at the December sky over Market Street, which was gray and flat and unremarkable, and I thought, it's done. The letter is sent. Whatever happens next, I did the right thing. Pamela did not call me. She did not email me. What she did 3 days after the letter arrived was call Dennis. I know this because Dennis called me. He called me on a Friday evening, and I could hear in his voice that he didn't know quite how to begin, so I waited. And after a moment he said, "Caro, Pamela called me. She's pretty upset. She says you're threatening to sue her." "I'm not threatening," I said. "My attorney sent her a demand letter. That's a legal document, not a threat. She says you're accusing her and Dad of stealing from you." "I'm not accusing," I said. "I have documentation." There was a pause. Dennis exhaled slowly. "She says Dad signed some papers a few years back, something about a family trust, and that you knew about it. She says you gave permission." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "Dennis, I have a report from a forensic document examiner that says my signature on those papers is not mine. I have bank statements for accounts I never opened. I have a HELOC on Grandma's house that I never applied for. If Pamela told you I knew about any of this, she's lying to you." Another pause. Longer this time. "Caro," he said, and his voice had changed, softer, more uncertain. Is this real? Yes, I said. I'm going to send you the summary report. Read it, then call me back. He called me back the next morning. He had read it. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, I didn't know. I want you to know I didn't know any of this. I know, I said. I believe you. What do you need from me? He asked. Nothing right now, I said. Just don't tell Pamela anything I've told you. And don't let her use you as a go-between. He said he understood. He kept his word. Pamela's attorney responded to David's letter on day 28. The response was a 4-page letter that did not deny the existence of the trust or the accounts. It did not deny that the funds had been withdrawn. What it argued was that Gerald Marsh had established the trust with the belief that he had his daughter's verbal authorization to do so, that the trust had been created for estate planning purposes to benefit Caroline Marsh as the primary beneficiary, and that any withdrawals from the trust had been made under a reasonable interpretation of Gerald's authority as the original grantor. It further argued that my father's death had rendered certain claims moot, and that Pamela, as surviving spouse, had no independent legal liability for actions taken by Gerald during his lifetime. It was, David told me, a creative argument. It was also, he said, not going to survive a motion to dismiss, because the argument that a grantor can establish a trust in someone else's name without that person's knowledge or consent, and then spend the trust assets on personal expenses, is not a legally cognizable theory of estate planning. It's just theft with extra steps. She's not going to settle, I said. No, David agreed. She's not. At least not yet. She still thinks she has room to maneuver. Does she? He looked at me across the conference table. Less than she thinks, he said. I want to pause here for a second because I know some of you are thinking, why didn't you just try to talk to her directly? Why didn't you sit down with Pamela and give her a chance to explain? And I understand that impulse. I understand it because I felt it. There was a part of me that wanted to sit across from her and ask her to look me in the eye and tell me why. That part of me wanted an explanation more than it wanted a judgment. But here is what I knew, professionally and personally. You do not negotiate with someone who is still lying to you. You do not sit across from someone who has submitted a legal response claiming your father had verbal authorization when you have a forensic report saying the signature on the document is forged. You don't negotiate with the lie. You document it, and you let the process do what it's designed to do. David filed the civil complaint in Maricopa County Superior Court on a Monday morning in January. The complaint named Pamela Marsh as the primary defendant and Rhonda Garrett as a secondary defendant. It alleged fraud, forgery, breach of fiduciary duty, unjust enrichment, and civil conspiracy. It sought damages of $412,000 plus attorney's fees and costs. It was accompanied by a motion for a temporary restraining order, freezing the Sedona vacation property, and any other assets that could be traced to the trust withdrawals. The court granted the TRO on the Sedona property within 48 hours. A property worth approximately $290,000, purchased with $62,000 of my money as a down payment, was now frozen pending the outcome of the litigation. I also filed a complaint with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. This was a separate process. The civil and criminal tracks run independently. And I want to be precise about what I was asking for. I was not asking for prosecutors to punish Pamela because I was angry. I was providing them with documentation of what appeared to be criminal conduct, forgery of my signature on a HELOC application and trust documents, identity theft, and financial fraud. What they did with that documentation was their decision, not mine. I gave them the forensic report, the bank records, the trace analysis, and the notarization records. I gave them Rhonda Garrett's name and her relationship to Pamela. And then I waited. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office opened an investigation in February. I know this because a detective named Ramos called me to take my statement. He was thorough and professional. And he asked many of the same questions David had asked, and a few different ones, specifically about whether I had ever given anyone a power of attorney that could have authorized them to sign on my behalf. I had not. My mother had a limited POA for medical decisions that I'd set up years ago when I'd had minor surgery, but it was specific to medical decisions and had lapsed anyway. There was no document anywhere that gave my father or Pamela the authority to sign my name on anything financial. Rhonda Garrett, when contacted by the detective, initially said she had notarized the documents in good faith after being presented with what she believed was valid identification. When the detective informed her that the forensic analysis indicated the signatures were forged and that the identification she had allegedly seen did not match my actual driver's license format at the time, she asked for an attorney. That was on a Thursday. By the following Monday, her attorney had contacted the prosecutor's office to discuss cooperation. I learned this from David, who had a contact in the county attorney's office. I did not follow the criminal proceedings closely. I want to be honest about that. I found it difficult to track the criminal case with the same precision I applied to the civil case, because the criminal case was about punishment, and I did not know how to feel about punishment. The civil case was about restoration, getting my money back, clearing the debt from my property, establishing the record. That I could engage with. The criminal case required me to think about Pamela going to prison. And when I tried to think about that, I found myself in a place that was complicated in a way that didn't resolve into anything useful. My father was dead. He could not be charged. He could not sit across from a judge and answer for what he'd done. The man who had, I now believed, originated this scheme, who had identified my grandmother's property as an asset, who had found a corrupt notary through his wife's church contacts, who had set up the P.O. box in my childhood zip code so the mail would go somewhere he could control. That man was in a cemetery in Scottsdale, and the law could not reach him. The law could only reach Pamela and Rhonda Garrett. And so the criminal case was, in some ways, the case I least knew what to do with emotionally. What I did know was this. Pamela had signed the trust documents as co-trustee. Pamela had made withdrawals from the trust. Pamela had purchased a vacation property in Sedona with trust funds. Pamela had, according to Rhonda Garrett's eventual statement to investigators, been present at the kitchen table in Rhonda's home in Tempe when the documents were notarized. The person who had signed my name on those documents was not identified in Rhonda's statement. She said a woman she did not know had been brought by Pamela and had signed the documents while Rhonda notarized them. A woman Rhonda did not know, which meant that there was a third person, someone who had physically put pen to paper and written what they believed was my signature, who has never been identified. I don't know who that person was. I have thought about it. I have not been able to land anywhere conclusive. The civil case moved through the Maricopa County Superior Court over the following 8 months. I want to tell you about 2 moments in that process that I think about still. The first was a deposition. Pamela was deposed by David in April, 4 months after the complaint was filed. I was not in the room. I was in Philadelphia. But David sent me the transcript the same day. I read it that night at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold. Pamela's answers were careful. She had been well prepared by her attorney. She answered, "I don't recall," 47 times. I counted. 47 instances of not recalling over the course of a 7-hour deposition about events that had taken place in her own home, at her own bank, involving her own finances. The most revealing moment in the transcript was not one of the 47 non-recalls. It was a moment when David asked her directly, "Mrs. Marsh, did you ever tell Caroline Marsh that a trust had been established in her name?" And Pamela said, "Gerald handled that." Not, "I don't recall." Not, "No." Gerald handled that. Past tense. Definitive. The answer of someone who knows the trust was established and is trying to redirect responsibility toward a dead man. David noted that answer in his trial preparation notes with a single word: admission. The second moment was in July. I flew to Phoenix for a mediation session that Pamela's attorney had requested, a last attempt to settle before trial. I sat across a conference table from Pamela for the first time since I had taken the key from the mug in my father's study. She looked smaller than I remembered. She was wearing a blue blazer, and she had her hands folded on the table in front of her. And she looked at me the way people look at someone they are trying to assess. Not with guilt, but with calculation. Trying to figure out what I wanted. Trying to find the lever. The mediator opened with a summary of the parties' positions. Pamela's attorney proposed a settlement of $180,000, structured as a payment plan over 5 years, in exchange for a full release of all claims. David and I had discussed our response in advance. I leaned forward slightly and said, "No." Pamela's attorney said, Ms. Marsh, perhaps we could discuss a modified structure." "The structure isn't the issue," I said. "The amount is the issue. We're not releasing claims for half of what was taken." Pamela cleared her throat. It was the first time she'd made a sound since the session began. "Caroline," she said, and her voice was very controlled, "your father loved you. Everything he did for this family." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "Which family? Because this one had a P.O. box I didn't know about." She didn't answer. The mediator moved on. The mediation ended without a settlement. Trial was scheduled for October. In September, 11 days before trial, Pamela's attorney contacted David with a new offer: $350,000, structured as a lump sum payment from the proceeds of the Sedona property sale, plus a confession of judgment that would allow me to pursue the remaining balance if the property sale fell short. In exchange, I would release Pamela from any further civil claims. The criminal case would proceed independently. I had no ability to stop it. And David made clear to her attorney that I would not be providing any statement in mitigation. I accepted the settlement. I want to be precise about why. It was not because $350,000 was enough. It was less than the full damages, and I knew that. It was because the property sale was imminent, the funds were available, and a bird in hand in civil litigation is worth considerably more than a theoretical judgment that might take years to collect. It was because David assessed that the risk of going to trial, not losing, but the time, the cost, the exposure of spending another year in this process, was not worth the incremental recovery. And it was because I was tired, not defeated, tired. There is a difference, and I want to be clear about it. I was tired in the way you get tired after a year of carrying something heavy. And the chance to set it down and walk away was worth something that didn't appear on any balance sheet. The Sedona property sold in October. The settlement funds were wired to David's trust account and distributed to me within 30 days. The HELOC on my grandmother's property in Chandler was paid off in full from the settlement proceeds. The remaining balance came to me as net recovery. After David's fees and costs, I recovered $284,000. That is not the full amount that was taken. It is what the process produced, and I have made my peace with it. Rhonda Garrett, in exchange for her cooperation with the criminal investigation, was charged with a single count of fraudulent notarization, a Class 6 felony in Arizona, and entered a plea agreement in which she was sentenced to 2 years of probation and permanently barred from serving as a notary public in the state of Arizona. She paid a fine of $5,000. I was asked whether I wanted to submit a victim impact statement in her case. I wrote one. It was 3 paragraphs long. I stated the facts of the harm, noted that her cooperation had been valuable to the investigation, and said I had no specific sentencing recommendation. The judge noted my statement in the record. Pamela was charged in November with 1 count of fraud, 1 count of identity theft, and 1 count of theft by taking, all felonies under Arizona law. Her attorney negotiated a plea agreement. She pled guilty to fraud and identity theft. The theft charge was dismissed as part of the agreement. She was sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation, ordered to pay restitution of $28,000, the difference between the civil settlement and the full damages amount, and required to complete 200 hours of community service. She did not serve prison time. Her attorney argued her age, her lack of prior criminal record, and her cooperation with the civil settlement as mitigating factors. The judge accepted those arguments. I was not in the courtroom for her sentencing. I was in Philadelphia, at my office, reviewing a client file. David texted me the outcome. I read the text at my desk, set my phone face down, and went back to the file I was reviewing. I finished the review before I let myself think about it further. That is not coldness. That is how I managed to get through a year of this without losing the thread of my own life. I want to tell you what the year cost me that doesn't appear in any legal document. It cost me sleep for about 4 months. Not every night, but enough nights that I noticed the pattern and started tracking it the way I track everything. On a notepad on my nightstand, a simple tally of the nights I slept through versus the nights I didn't. The tally ran about 60-40 in favor of not sleeping for the first quarter of the year. By the second quarter, it had evened out. By summer, I was sleeping through most nights. And the ones I didn't were the ones that happened to fall around significant dates. The day I found the key, the day I opened the P.O. box, my father's birthday in May. It cost me the ability to look at family photographs without doing a kind of mental audit. There is a photograph on my bookshelf, my father and me at my college graduation, 2003. And for a long time after I found the P.O. box, I couldn't look at it without calculating. Calculating what he'd known then, what he'd been planning then, whether the fraud had been conceived then or later. Eventually, I concluded it had been conceived much later, probably around the time I inherited my grandmother's property, when the asset became visible and the opportunity presented itself. But the calculation habit stuck. I still look at that photograph sometimes and feel the numbers running in the background, adding up to something I don't have a name for. It cost me my easy relationship with Dennis, at least for a while. Not because he did anything wrong, he didn't, but because he was part of the family context in which this had happened. And for several months I found it difficult to talk to him without the whole architecture of what had been done pressing into the conversation. We got through it. We are closer now, in some ways, than we were before, because we have had to be honest with each other in ways that families of our particular type, Midwestern adjacent, conflict averse, good at the surface, don't usually manage. He came to Philadelphia in March, and we went to dinner, and he said, "I keep thinking about what he was like when we were kids, and I keep trying to figure out if this was always in him or if it happened later." I told him I had the same question, and I had stopped trying to answer it because the answer didn't change the facts. He nodded. We ordered dessert. It was the most honest conversation I've ever had with my brother. It cost me my uncomplicated grief. That is the one I come back to most. I had 41 years of loving my father, and the last year of his life, and the year after his death, have been spent understanding that he was capable of something I would not have believed him capable of. Those two things, the love and the understanding, do not cancel each other out. They coexist in a way that is uncomfortable and probably permanent. I have been in therapy since February of the year I found the key. My therapist's name is Dr. Sandra Kowalski, and she has a practice in Center City, Philadelphia, and she is the first person I have ever paid specifically to help me think about my father. Not the fraud. My father. The man who called every birthday for 12 minutes. The man who said my name once, very clearly, when he was dying. The man who had a key and a mug on his desk that opened a box full of my mail. Dr. Kowalski asked me once, about 6 months into our sessions, what I would say to my father if I could. I thought about it for a long time. Then I said, I would ask him if he ever thought I'd find out. I would ask him what he thought would happen if I did. I would ask him whether, in those 14 months when he was sick and the money was coming out of the trust to pay his bills, whether he thought about calling me and telling me the truth and asking for my help. Whether he thought I would have helped him. I paused. And I would tell him that I would have. I would have helped him. He didn't have to do any of it. Dr. Kowalski didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, I think you already know that. I think that's the hardest part. She was right. That is the hardest part. Not that he took the money. That he didn't trust me enough to ask. If you think what I did, following the legal process, filing the complaints, pursuing the civil case to settlement, was the right thing to do, I hope you'll share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because I know there are people listening who are in situations where someone in their family has done something financially harmful to them, and they are sitting with the question of whether to act, whether the relationship is worth more than the harm, whether family loyalty should override the law. And I want to say something to those people very directly. The law exists for exactly this situation. Not for strangers who steal from you. For everyone who steals from you. The fact that someone shares your blood does not make the theft smaller. It makes it larger because it required a deeper betrayal to accomplish. I want to tell you about the mailbox. My house in Philadelphia is a row house in West Philadelphia, a neighborhood I have lived in for 11 years. The house has a front porch with 2 steps down to the sidewalk. And at the bottom of the steps, there is a black iron mailbox mounted to the brick, with a slot for letters and a small door at the bottom for packages. It is an ordinary mailbox. I have checked it approximately 4,000 times in the 11 years I have lived here without thinking about it. For the first 6 months after I found the P.O. box in Chandler, I checked my Philadelphia mailbox with a precision that I can only describe as forensic. I checked the return addresses on every piece of mail. I noted anything unexpected. I pulled my credit report every 30 days. You are entitled to 1 free report per bureau per year, and I was pulling from all 3 on a rotating schedule. And I scanned it for new accounts, new inquiries, anything that didn't belong. I set up fraud alerts with all 3 bureaus. I placed a credit freeze that I have maintained to this day. I enrolled in an identity monitoring service. I changed the passwords on every financial account I held. Enabled 2-factor authentication on everything that supported it. And set up email and text alerts for any transaction over $25 on any account. These were not paranoid actions. They were appropriate actions for someone who had had their identity used to establish fraudulent accounts and take out a $340,000 loan. They were the actions of someone who had learned, at considerable cost, what it looks like when your financial identity is being used without your knowledge, and who had decided that the cost of vigilance was lower than the cost of not being vigilant. By the end of the first year, I had relaxed the 30-day credit pull to quarterly. I kept the freeze. I kept the fraud alerts. I kept the transaction notifications. But I stopped examining each piece of mail with the particular attention of someone who has been burned. I started checking the mailbox the way I used to, quickly, on my way in from work, pulling out the envelopes without looking at each one until I got inside. The day I noticed that shift, the day I realized I had come in from work and gone through the mail standing at the kitchen counter without once checking a return address with any special attention, I stood in my kitchen for a moment and recognized it as something. Not a milestone exactly, more like a watermark. A line on the wall showing how far the water had risen and how far it had receded. I have a card taped to the inside of my kitchen cabinet, just above the shelf where I keep my coffee mugs. It's a 4x6 index card, and I wrote on it in blue pen about 8 months after everything settled. 4 rules. I'm going to read them to you exactly as I wrote them, because the wording matters. 1. I do not sign anything I have not read in full, regardless of who is asking and regardless of the circumstances. 2. I do not give anyone access to my financial information, my social security number, or my property documents for any purpose without a written agreement that specifies the purpose and limits the access. 3. I do not allow guilt to substitute for clarity. If a request makes me feel guilty for hesitating, I wait 24 hours before responding. 4. I check my credit report quarterly. This is not optional. Below the 4 rules, I wrote one more line, smaller, in the bottom corner of the card. These are not punishments. They are guardrails. The kind you install after you've seen what happens when the road has none. I look at that card most mornings when I get my coffee mug down from the shelf. Not always consciously, but it's there. It's been there for 2 years now, and the edges of the card have gone a little soft, and the blue ink has faded slightly in the way that things fade when they've been in the same place for a while. I haven't replaced the card. I think I won't. My grandmother's house on West Pecos Road in Chandler is still mine. After the HELOC was paid off from the settlement proceeds, I retained the property management company and continued renting it. The current tenants are a couple in their early 30s. He teaches high school history. She works as a pediatric nurse. They have been there for a year and a half. They paid their rent on time every month. They asked about 6 months in whether they could put in a small raised garden bed in the backyard. I said yes. The property manager sent me a photograph of it in April. Tomatoes, peppers, some herbs in terracotta pots along the fence. My grandmother grew roses in that backyard for 40 years. The garden bed is not roses. It is something else. I think she would have liked it. I drove past the house once last summer when I was in Arizona for a work conference. I didn't stop. I drove past slowly, the way you drive past something you want to see without being seen seeing it. The shutters were a different color than when my grandmother had lived there. She'd kept them white, and these tenants had painted them a dark green that suited the desert landscaping better. There was a bicycle leaning against the porch railing, a child's drawing taped inside the front window, visible from the street, crayon figures in primary colors, the universal grammar of a child's picture of a family. I drove past and I kept going. And I thought about my grandmother, who had left me that house because she trusted me with it. And I thought about what it meant that someone had used that trust, her trust in me and my trust in my father, as a vehicle for fraud. I thought about it for a long time. And then I turned onto the highway and drove back to my hotel. Dennis and I talk every week now. Sunday evenings usually, while he's making dinner for his family, and I'm doing whatever I'm doing. Reading, working, watching something on television. The calls last between 20 and 40 minutes. We talk about his kids, about work, about whatever is in the news that week. We talk about our mother, who is healthy and 72, and has opinions about everything. We don't talk about our father very often, but when we do, we are honest in a way we weren't before. Dennis said something to me about 3 months ago that I have thought about since. He said, "I keep wondering if I should have known, if there was something I missed." I told him there wasn't. I told him that the people who knew about it had worked hard to make sure no one else knew, and that not knowing was not the same as complicity. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know, but I still think about it." I told him I understood that. I do. My mother knows the full story. I told her in stages over the course of several months, because I didn't want to give her everything at once, and because I was still processing it myself as I told her. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which is not her natural mode. Lorraine Marsh has opinions, and she expresses them, which is something I have always loved about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother would be livid." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed about any of it, and it was exactly the right thing to say. My mother also said later in the same conversation, "You did the right thing, Caroline. I know it didn't feel like the right thing every day, but you did it." I told her it helped to hear that. She said, "You would have done it anyway." She was right. But it still helped to hear it. I got a promotion at work in March of last year. Senior forensic accountant. with a team of 3 junior staff reporting to me, and a significant increase in the complexity and size of the engagements I handle. My managing partner, a woman named Ellen Cho, told me in my review that I had shown exceptional judgment and resilience over the past 2 years, and that the firm was lucky to have me. I thanked her. I did not tell her what the past 2 years had actually looked like from the inside, but I thought about it on the drive home. I thought about the fact that the skills I use every day, reading documents for what they don't say, following money through a sequence of transactions, knowing what a forged signature looks like because I know what a real one looks like, those skills had been the thing that had saved me. Not just professionally, personally. The competence that my family had sometimes mocked, the accountant said with a particular kind of dismissiveness, as though precision were a character flaw, had been the thing that found the fraud and built the case and recovered the money. I sat in my car in the parking garage of my building, and I thought about that for 4 minutes. Then I went upstairs and made dinner. There is a photograph on my bookshelf. My father and me at my college graduation, 2003. He's wearing a blue tie, and he's squinting a little in the sun. And I'm in my cap and gown, and I'm laughing at something someone off camera said, and his hand is on my shoulder. We look like a father and daughter at a graduation. We look ordinary and happy, and like a family. I have not taken the photograph down. I have thought about taking it down, and I have decided not to. Not because I want to pretend the last 4 years didn't happen, but because 2003 was real. That moment was real. The man with his hand on my shoulder at my graduation was real. What he did later was also real. Both things are true, and neither one cancels the other out. And the photograph stays on the shelf because I am not going to let what he did in the last years of his life erase everything that came before it. That is my decision. I have made it deliberately, and I stand by it. If this story made you feel something, I want to ask you to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you know someone who is in a situation where a family member has done something financially harmful to them and they don't know what to do, share this with them. Not because my story is a template. Every situation is different, and not every situation calls for the same response. But because I want them to know that there is a process. That there are people, lawyers, forensic accountants, forensic document examiners, investigators, whose job it is to follow the money and find the truth. That you do not have to figure it out alone. That the complexity of your feelings about the person who harmed you does not have to determine whether you protect yourself. You can love someone and still hold them accountable. You can grieve someone and still pursue justice. Those things are not mutually exclusive. I know this because I have lived both of them simultaneously. And it is hard. And it is survivable. And it is the right thing to do. My name is Caroline Marsh. I am a certified public accountant and a forensic accountant. I have a house in West Philadelphia and a rental property in Chandler, Arizona, and a brother in Austin who calls me every Sunday. I have a therapist who helps me think about my father in ways that are honest and complicated and don't resolve into anything simple. I have a list of 4 rules on an index card in my kitchen cabinet. I have a credit freeze on all 3 bureaus and transaction alerts on every account I hold. I have a mailbox at the bottom of my front steps. I checked it this morning. Everything in it was addressed to me. All of it delivered to my house. Nobody had rewrote it. Nobody was reading my bank statements. Nobody was using my name to build something I didn't know about. The mail was mine. The house is mine. The name on the documents is mine. And the signature on those documents is mine. And I know what my signature looks like. The capital C that opens to the right and closes with a slightly counterclockwise return. The particular pressure distribution that has been consistent across 20 years of documents. And no one will ever put it on a page without me knowing it. The late afternoon sun came through the kitchen window this morning and made a rectangle of gold on the floor, and I stood in it for a moment with my coffee and my mail and the ordinary Tuesday quiet of a house that belongs to me. My name is Caroline Marsh, and this is my house.